Good evening. I'm Tom Putnam, the Edward W. Kane Executive Director of the Concord Museum. On behalf of my colleagues and our Board of Governors, I want to thank you for joining this special forum, which we are using as a kickoff for the museum's next major temporary exhibit, Every Path Laid Open, Women of Concord and the Quest for Equality. The title comes from a quote by Margaret Fuller, a frequent visitor to Concord, in which she suggested that the female reformers of her day would not rest once they had secured the right to vote, for their goal must be no less than to, quote, have every path laid open to woman as freely as to man. The exhibit will chronicle women throughout Concord's past and highlight artifacts from our collection that tell their stories. A special media component will celebrate today's women of Concord, from educators to entrepreneurs, firefighters to farmers, athletes to activists, who are fulfilling Margaret Fuller's vision. Let me pause here and thank the exhibit corporate sponsors, and it's not too late for your company or organization to be added to that list, including lead sponsor the Arbella Insurance Foundation, and corporate sponsors Middlesex Savings Bank, Northbridge Insurance, Woodman and Eaton, and State Street. We also have a number of individual sponsors, too many to name, but whose support will be acknowledged on a panel in the exhibit itself. Due to the pandemic, we've chosen to delay the opening of the exhibition slightly. It will now open on Thursday, May 6th, when we hope and trust it will be safer to gather again in small groups. We're hosting this kickoff event early since, as you may know, Samantha Power has been nominated by President Biden to be the next director of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. She agreed to pre-record this conversation last week, even as she was preparing for her confirmation hearing. To give the discussion a live component, we asked teachers at the 3 high schools in Concord to nominate students to ask questions on your behalf, which for me was one of the best parts of the forum. I know they and their families are watching tonight, so I want to thank them again for their thoughtful questions and confidence in asking them. Commemorating our shared history, let me say first a word about Margaret Fuller, who made a name for herself among the Transcendentalists as the editor of an important periodical of their writings called The Dial, as a front-page columnist for Horace Greeley and the New York Tribune, and as Emerson's friend and Thoreau's editor. Biographer Megan Marshall describes Fuller as, quote, an ardent and onward-looking spirit whose writing was eloquent, assured, and uncannily prescient. She strove to realize her talents in an era unfriendly to openly ambitious women. Yet, despite those obstacles, she achieved almost inconceivable success with remarkable poise. In her most influential book, Women in the 19th Century, published in 1845, Fuller heralded an era in which every path would be laid open to women. Let them be sea captains, if you will, she cried. Would that she had been a sea captain herself, for the tragic irony of her life and death is that she drowned off the coast of Long Island in 1850 through the incompetence of the man serving as captain of that ship on which she, her husband, and infant son were returning from Europe. She was 40 years old, her child not yet 2. She had traveled to Rome to serve essentially as a foreign correspondent, covering the 1848 revolution. Offering her views from Italy in a New York Tribune column on the U.S. government's need to appoint an ambassador to the new Roman Republic, Margaret Fuller conjectured, another century, and I might ask to be made ambassador myself. But at the time, she was forced to admit, quote, women's day has not yet come. Samantha Power began her professional career as a crusading international journalist, later won the Pulitzer Prize in History, and was nominated by President Barack Obama to serve as the United States ambassador to the United Nations after having first served as a member of his Senate staff, a campaign advisor, and a member of his National Security Council. In her memoir, The Education of an Idealist, she describes the harrowing choices and obstacles her mother, another ambitious young woman, faced in her native Ireland, causing her mother to seek a divorce from a court reluctant to grant one, and to emigrate to the United States with her 2 young children, and thus fulfill her dreams of becoming a kidney specialist. Arriving in Pittsburgh at age 9, Ambassador Power threw herself into sports, Avenues opened to her as her family moved to Atlanta, where she attended high school. And then she received an internship at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace after graduating from Yale, all of which she writes imbued her with, quote, an immigrant's optimism and a deeply held appreciation to her new homeland. I first met Samantha Power 18 years ago after her return from the Balkans, where she was a stringer for the Boston Globe, when she participated in a forum in 2003 that I helped organize at the Kennedy Library with another pioneering Boston Globe journalist, Elizabeth Newfer, who you'll hear more about in a few minutes. The library then hosted Samantha Power again and again, both for celebratory occasions, including to discuss her books, A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide, and Chasing the Flame, Sergio Vieira de Mello and the Fight to Save the World, and somber occasions, including a memorial service the library hosted for Elizabeth Newfer after she died in a car crash while covering the war in Iraq, and a tribute to the late Tony Lewis, the New York Times columnist who played a pivotal role in encouraging Ambassador Power to write her book on genocide. Let me conclude with one story that I hope captures the spirit of this extraordinary person we are about to spend the next hour with, and which gives a flavor of the memoir that I encourage you to read if you have not had the chance to do so. I had hoped to have Ambassador Power speak about this topic in our conversation, but alas, we ran out of time. While at the United Nations, in an atmosphere she describes of rising repression and democratic backsliding around the world, she and her team decided to focus less on the overall human rights recession and more on bringing attention and aid to specific individuals, namely 20 women who had been imprisoned in their respective nations. The initiative was called #FreeThe20 and was part of a partnership with the then 20 female sitting United States senators, Republican and Democrat alike. Every day for 20 years and for 20 days, Ambassador Power posted a video to Facebook in which she described an imprisoned international woman and the charges against her. Her UN staff then hung a jumbo photo of the woman in the large glass windows in the lobby of the US mission directly across the street from the entrance to the United Nations headquarters. Dignitaries attending the UN General Assembly, as well as anyone walking down First Avenue, had little choice but to pass this expanding series of portraits. The book outlines the stories of these women, 16 of whom, and perhaps more since the book was published, have been freed from prison. In her memoir, Samantha Power writes, quote, "We had made only a microscopic dent in a colossal problem, but for each one of these women and those around them, it was the universe. When facing global issues," she writes, "even if we can't solve the whole problem, surely there is something we can do." In a time when a Nobel Peace Laureate, duly elected president of her country, falls prey to a military coup, and we watch as those supporting the reformers in Russia are jailed, it is inspiring to be in the presence of the likes of Samantha Power, an ardent and onward-looking spirit who, like Margaret Fuller, has achieved almost inconceivable success with remarkable poise. She makes one proud to be an American. Let's hear from her now. Former United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Pulitzer Prize winning author, professor of Harvard Law and Harvard Kennedy School, and Concord resident, Samantha Power, thank you so much for joining us for this program.
I'm delighted.
I'd like to ask you a few questions to open, to give a flavor of the memoir for those who haven't read it yet. I'll note that it's just come out in paperback and is available at the Concord Bookshop. And I'll also suggest to our audience that while candy and flowers are always nice gifts, nothing would say Happy Valentine's Day better to your loved ones than this wonderful and inspiring autobiography. And then I hope to have some time to ask you some general questions, Ambassador Power, that emanate from the book and relate to the museum's upcoming Women of Concord exhibit. And also we're sharing this with the high schools here in Concord. So my focus will be kind of what your story can do to help inspire young students today. So first, let's just start with, after your service in the Obama administration, our audience is Concord-centric. They might be interested why you and your husband, Cass Sunstein, decided to move to Concord and raise your children here.
Well, what puzzles Cass and me is why the entire planet doesn't live in Concord. why why we were able to find a house miraculously. I just don't know any other place I've ever visited that combines kind of history, uh, accessibility, and kind of, ease of getting to and fro and getting your kids into, this sporting program or that, with nature and proximity to a major city. So it's got everything. I mean, it actually moving here inspired Cass Sunstein, my husband, to write a book on impeachment, because we began to dig into the history of our house, which was built in 1763, apparently, and was lived in by Ephraim Wood. And Ephraim Wood was the street we live on was named after him, but he's buried in one of the local cemeteries. But Ephraim actually had a store of munitions in the basement of our house. And on what is now we now know of as Patriots Day, when the British came to Concord and of course went to the North Bridge, they also came to our house and tried to raid the house. And there was a British spy who lived across the street in a house I can see from here. And the British spy actually had more loyalty to Ephraim than he did to the British. So he told them, the British, not to burn the house down. Ephraim, meanwhile, had skedaddled, somehow hauling these munitions onto a little, what in our imaginations at least, kind of handcrafted little boat on the river here, and basically scrammed with this store of munitions. But it was one of, fewer than a dozen locations where people had stored up, in terms of preparing for self-defense of some kind. So what everybody else knows about is the shot heard around the world and what happened on the North Bridge, and the casualties that were taken by Concordians in those days. But for us and for our kids to be associated with the beginnings and sort of that conception of what kind of republic we wanted to build, free from ever being in danger of having a royal or a monarch or lacking checks and balances. That story, and the more we dug into it, the more we learned, you can imagine it kind of captured the imagination. So that's what led Cass into a kind of look. Again, he'd been a constitutional law professor, but, into the kind of founding debates, particularly as it related to, what do you do when a king strays in the United Kingdom or in England at that time, and then as the founders thought about, like, what are the checks once we put a president in place who's of course electable and accountable to the people. So that's an improvement. But what happens over the life of that 4 years if something untoward happens? And so, but for Ephraim Wood and moving to Concord, Cass would not have done this. I think pretty important study of the history of impeachment.
Fascinating. I gave a plug for your book. I'll give a plug for our museum, and I hope we can get your family to come over. We just opened a $1.2 million exhibit about April 19th, and it's interactive. Yeah, I think your children would enjoy coming to see it, so we would love to have you come sometime.
Well, we're big fans of the museum, I should say, Tom. Just we've been multiple times to the pre-renovation museum. Anytime someone comes to town, we drag them over there, but we haven't been to the renovations.
Great, good. Well, please, once the air clears, and we can all
your
be out and about.
Your timing was not ideal, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. So again, thinking of these students who are going to watch this program, I thought, can you, just briefly tell that story of how you transitioned from having thought you'd wanted to be a sports journalist to becoming more of a human rights activist?
Yeah, I mean, I will share the story in part because I think when I encounter young people today, they kind of think, many of them, that they need to know who they are at an early stage, or they look around, they see their classmates kind of creating clubs and, being super engaged on different issues, and they think that's not me, and therefore, I'm not going to find my calling, and it can just sneak up on you. And so I think my main message is just to, open heart, open mind, and just to have your head up from your gadgets occasionally to see what's going on around you, or even on your gadget, something might hit you like a lightning bolt. For me, I am an immigrant to America. I moved to Pittsburgh, not by myself. I was 9. My mother moved us there from Ireland in 1979. And my way of fitting in was sports. It's a lot like Red Sox Nation there in Pittsburgh, like Steelers, the Pirates were huge. It was my way of kind of adopting the local currency, talking to the kids at school. And so I became really into sports, playing sports, talking about sports. When I went to college, I had this amazing opportunity to go to Yale University, yet all I did there was talk about sports, play sports. And what happened was after my first year in college, thinking that if I couldn't play professional sports, which is becoming increasingly likely that I couldn't, that I would become a sports broadcaster of some kind. And I was doing play-by-play for the Yale basketball team, and I was one of a handful of people who had a sports talk show at night. So I went and I worked as an intern in the sports department of the CBS affiliate in Atlanta, Georgia, and was sitting taking notes on a Braves game when the footage, this is a long time ago for the young people watching, but June of 1989, really long time ago. But for me, I was 18, again, just having experienced my first year in college, taking notes on a Braves game so I could cut the little sports highlights on the evening news, which was my job. But on the news feed next to where I was watching the Braves game came footage from a place called Tiananmen Square, which is in downtown Beijing. And there in Tiananmen Square, very much unlike today, you had this flowering of protests by young people, students, high school students, college students, just saying, we want to be able to speak our minds. We want to be able to gather if we want. We want to be able to pray the way we want to pray. I mean, whatever it was, basically a plea for liberalization. But when I happened to be there and kind of seeing the protests, it just by coincidence was the day that the Chinese government decided to crack down. And so what I saw on the live newsfeed, uncut, unfiltered, was these tanks kind of storming these kids. And so I was all in on sports, and this is why I say serendipity and just keeping your head up, can be helpful at some point in ways you don't anticipate. But as I just sat there with my pen in hand and my clipboard, doing my job, it wasn't that I thought one day I'm going to be UN ambassador and a member of the president's cabinet. I mean, it would have been as far-fetched as saying I'm going to go live on the moon or play center field for the Pirates, for that matter. I mean, it was all I said to myself in being so moved by what was happening to those kids was, I'm going to go back to college and I'm going to learn more. I'm just going to there's all this stuff happening in the world and I don't know enough. I mean, and yet I'm moved by this, but I'm moved kind of cluelessly. So I think that the second dimension of this, Tom, just for young people, is to admit what you don't know, and is really hard. When, especially, young people today, they might be, they're not good at everything, but they might have something that they're really good at. And once you get good at something, it's hard to be really crummy at something else. And so for me, I was like rattling off statistics about Major League Baseball or the NBA. I mean, I was like, felt I had this area of relative expertise, but to go back to campus and to just kind of, again, embrace my, the vast, holes in my knowledge of the world and, take courses where I felt like the dumbest person in the class, that was a big hurdle to overcome. And I subscribed to the New York Times when I went back, having been mainly just a Sports Illustrated and sports sort of news reader. And I began underlining, the content of the articles because I was trying to fill these just yawning gaps in my understanding of the world. I mean, I knew geography decently, but apart from that, I didn't know the history. I didn't know who was in charge. I didn't know the politics. So all of this to say, again, there's, some people have lightning bolts, but most people have these kind of little pivot moments, which don't take them to large, sweeping kind of proclamations about what they're going to do in the world, but maybe just reorient them just a tad. And I think that's what I was very fortunate happened to me. So I became a different kind of college student, maybe a little bit more dedicated altogether. But just I still was crazy about sports and that was still my full-time pursuit, it felt like, but just the balance was a little bit different. And above all, I think I made myself vulnerable by being okay starting at ground zero. And I think for a lot of people, they are intimidated by doing something like that. They feel they kind of have to be an expert. They see their peers, especially, again, how sophisticated some young people are today on climate or on race or on, you name it. And not all of us start sophisticated. You have to start somewhere.
Mhm. So we'll have to skip ahead some. You get an internship after college, but then what drew you to becoming a foreign correspondent and going over to the former Yugoslavia? Just kind of
Yeah,
explain how.
I mean, it was again a fair amount of serendipity, but I think the foundation was that, like young people today, I was actually probably one of the first generations that in American public schools was learning a lot about the Holocaust. When I was a young person, so I read Anne Frank's diary, I read Elie Wiesel's Memoir at Night, and as examples, this was in the 1990s. The President Clinton, in that case, ended up opening a museum on the Mall in
Mhm.
Washington. That's where Jefferson and Lincoln and all of our presidents sort of stand. We have these tributes to them, but then there was going to be a museum also about the Holocaust. And I think that was part of a really important political consciousness around the idea of never again. So I wouldn't have been able to articulate what I'm articulating to you now at the time, but I think this idea that we would never again as a country stand idly by when people were being subjected to genocide probably just got into me somewhere. It, again, wouldn't have been top of mind, but it was just part of my American education. And it was the 1990s, so the Berlin Wall had fallen, the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, which had made international cooperation really hard for the kind of almost 50 years since the Second World War, 40 plus years, that had ended. So there was this great sense of possibility and promise when I graduated from college in 1992. At the same time, in the heart of Europe, right where World War II had happened, there were concentration camps that had been set up, rounding people up, women and men alike, different kinds of camps, rape camps for the women, and camps where people were executed and starved to death and beaten, pulverized for the men and boys. But this. It seemed like an anomaly against this backdrop of hope. That now finally countries will be able to get along and cooperate. And my first job out of college was as an intern. I made full use of my internships, as you can hear, intern in the sports department, now intern out of college. Of course, from my parents' standpoint, they were like, internship, what about job? What about job job? But I had another internship, and the person I worked for, this is with the good luck in it all, was someone also consumed by what was happening in Bosnia. I mean, I was a layman, kid, graduate, rookie to Washington. And I just thought, gosh, like all this stuff, these horrors are being perpetrated, and neither the US nor the UN nor the countries that comprise the UN or in Europe are doing much about it. So that was me not knowing much. And then my boss had been in the government for almost 35 years. He'd been ambassador to Turkey and to Thailand, and he just left. And he was much more informed about what the U.S. government could and might do. So I was his coffee pourer and his research assistant. And in working for him, it sort of affirmed my instinctive reaction. I thought, okay, well, he's sophisticated. I'm clueless, but he knows what he's talking about. And he's equally fired up about this and pressing, using his pulpit. He was the head of this think tank called the Carnegie Endowment, and using it to press President Clinton. So at the end of my internship with him, I had a sense I'd learned so much. It was the best job, I mean, to have right out of college. And these jobs are still out there. It's still a great place to work, especially as a young person who's interested in these kinds of current events. But when my time was up, I had a sense of, okay, I've learned a lot, but I need to learn a lot more. I'm still so new to all of this. And I thought a way to learn, a way maybe to help, would be to go over to the region. My hope was that I would stay outside the conflict area because I knew nothing about war zones. And initially, having been unable to find work as a humanitarian, since I had no skills as a liberal arts major, history major from Yale, I had been a sports reporter. So I knew how to write on deadline. I knew how to write, short 400, 600 word articles. And so I went over to the former Yugoslavia in the first instance as a freelance journalist. And was embraced by a community of young people who'd gone for very similar reasons to me, just wanting to try to make a difference, not knowing how. in this kind of post-Cold War heady period of believing that things were going to get better, and sort of wanting to do something in a small way about one of the things that was getting way worse. And so it was a little bit mission creep. I went thinking I'll stay in Croatia, it'll be peaceful, I won't freak out my parents. And then, of course, once I was there and getting to know the other journalists, I found my way into Bosnia, and ended up being a stringer for the Washington Post, the Economist, the Boston Globe right here, which was a wonderful, they were wonderful mentors to me, and was all along have been really fortunate in people kind of taking chances on me. And then more than that, offering counsel, as I've been at various career crossroads. And I think that's something for young people to really, there's like, what job do you want to do? And then who are the people around you whose actions you can, because people can mentor you without being capital M mentors. You can just kind of take it in and be watching. And then there's some who make time out of their schedules to give you advice in a great way.
You write in your book that sometimes concrete stories help more than kind of generalities. I just wanted to bring up a mutual acquaintance, friend of yours. I still have this book, Elizabeth Newfer, that was given out at her memorial service, and I might read a sentence or two. But before we get to that, just talk about, I know you were welcomed by a number of especially female journalists, but journalists there, but maybe just say a word or two about Elizabeth Newfer, since some people here in the Boston area probably still remember her and her reporting.
Yeah, I certainly hope they do. They should. So Elizabeth Newfer was an amazingly, intrepid reporter domestically as well, before she became an international correspondent. And while I was working, she was probably the most important person convincing me that I could go to the former Yugoslavia, that there would be a place for me. She was assigned by the Boston Globe to become the Berlin bureau chief. And in those days, again, there's plenty to see in Berlin with the reunification of Germany having just happened, but it was understood that her main job would be to go and cover the wars in the former Yugoslavia. I, as an intern working at this think tank, knew how much I didn't know, but compared to Elizabeth, who was just at that time, had just been named and was just coming up to speed, I got to know her a little bit. And it's a real measure of a person that my rank and my what's the opposite of seniority, my juniority, didn't really deter her, because I had been working like her. I'd been coming up to speed for a year. I mean, I was a kid, but she was interested in what I had read and what I had learned and how I had learned it, because she was going to go on that same journey to try to come up to speed. And at the end of, one of the lunches, she said, look, if you do decide to go over there, because I was already thinking about it, she said, I bet I can work it out so you could be the Boston Globe stringer in the area. And when you're not sure and you feel like it's going to be so inchoate, and it's like there's this bramble in front of you and you just don't know if there's any path. One of the reasons young people, for example, go to law school or do things like that, even when they want, maybe are more inclined to do other things, is that there's a path, right? It's very obvious kind of what that looks like, both in law school and beyond. There's no path to do anything like this. But Elizabeth, for me, really kind of cleared the path, just by creating the prospect of having an actual employer. I mean, not, just as a freelancer, but still like someone who was going to answer your phone call. She hooked me up with the then foreign editor, John Yema, at the time. He asked me for my clips, if I remember it rightly. And I said, well, I think I have, a clip, because at that time I visited once, and I said, does a clip count? And then a bunch from the women's volleyball team in college, and he was very patient with me. So I had only really the one clip, but Boston Globe, opened their hearts and their phone lines to me. And the big thing in those days, for young people, they won't understand this, but this is pre-cell phones, the internet was just getting going. So it was really important, if you had no money, as I had no money, that they just agree to take your collect phone calls, that you were able to reverse the charges. So that was really the extent of the commitment. But and then Elizabeth, whenever she came to town, we'd have lunch, I'd brief her on what I knew, I'd give her my Rolodex, but she always had advice and counsel. And tragically, as you alluded to, You know, after she did prize-winning work for the Globe in the former Yugoslavia, after she wrote an unbelievable book about reconciliation and the process of healing, you know, after and the process of being torn apart, she wrote that book again, which was acclaimed, but she ended up going to cover the war in Iraq and was killed in a terrible car accident in Iraq. But I think her legacy lives on among. There were so many people like me, you know, young women who went there and who saw her blazing a trail. She wasn't alone. There was Kate Adie with the BBC, Christiane Amanpour, of course, with CNN. But as a kind of crack beat reporter who just got by with hustle and relentlessness, and who, you know, had extended a hand down to bring other women up, she really was set the gold standard.
Yeah, I love this quote that you, in this little remembrance book, you said, while others were notorious for kissing up and kicking down, Noof worked in the reverse, kick and scream up at local officials, UN and NATO generals, Western diplomats, and embrace down to young correspondents and all around to Bosnian translators, friends, and neighbors.
Yeah, that's great.
Let's talk, though, you write in the book about yourself having to go in harm's way. At one point, your husband doesn't want you to travel to, or is concerned if you're traveling to Iraq to deal with refugees. And so the audience watching this program will both be young people thinking of careers that could bring them in harm's way, and their parents, likely, your Concord neighbors, and you have children, and I'm sure it makes you think differently about these things. Maybe just talk about that issue and how you think about that issue in your own life.
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure when I was younger, what my husband Cass Sunstein would call my cost benefit analysis would have been skewed right toward what young people are famous for, which is now has a term, optimism bias, right? So we all think we're young people especially think they're unlikely to encounter health hazards, and then all people of all ages, we all think we're better than the average driver. Smokers, you know, they know the risks of smoking, but don't think those risks apply to them. You know, so we all have this, and I think you have it more when you're younger. And I certainly, you know, kind of thought I could navigate and keep on the right side of danger. In retrospect, I was just incredibly fortunate. And in the end, the thing that sort of pushed me out of being a war correspondent, at least for that stint in Bosnia, was my brother, my kid brother, who you know, was leading a very different life than me. I would have been, let's say, 24, 25 at the time. He would have been 20. And when I called home to speak to my mother from Sarajevo or someplace, my brother, who'd like never weighed in on anything I'd done, but just said, man, like here I am thinking I'm all virtuous because I'm reporting on ethnic cleansing and, you know, doing God's work in my own mind. And my brother just says, you are so selfish. You have any idea what this is doing to mom? You know, our mother, this incredible woman who moved us to America from Ireland when we were kids, and you know, would never show it to me. She was never going to endanger imperil my ambition or my desire to make a difference in that way. So I had to hear it from him, and it really was a jolt, you know, that to actually, here I was trying to put myself in the shoes of the Bosnians or the shoes of my readers, but putting myself in the shoes of my mother ended up having a big effect. So that's one reason I left and ended up going to law school. But then, of course, now when I had kids, I went into the Obama administration years later, in January 2009, had my son Declan about 4 months later, and my daughter 3 years later. And man, it's different too than in that circumstance. I mean, then just my risk aversion goes way up. And I think you're right in noting just one of the kind of dangerous trips I took when I was in the government was, you know, to Iraq when there was an awful lot of violence underway. And I went, at that time I hadn't had my daughter, but I had my son Declan, and I just decided to do the exercise of writing the letter in case something happened. And as I wrote it, in addition to it being sort of impossible to write, and even all these years later, impossible to read. You know, but the thought I had was, oh my gosh, I mean, with these, what we now call forever wars, the number of letters like this that have been written by people who are risking everything, not to do some parachute in trip like I was doing, which was in and out, but living in Iraq, not just once, and not just living in Afghanistan once, but like 6, 7 tours of duty, and the toll that takes on families, and then the number of people who write those letters or don't write those letters, who don't come home. And so it brings home, I think, the stakes of the decision making, you know, that people who are often in kind of bubbles in Washington, you know, pretty isolated. The Situation Room famously has no windows, can have no windows for security reasons, but just to never forget the human consequences, you know. And I learned that from, in one dimension, when I was in Bosnia, thinking about the victims of conflict and all that American leadership could achieve to try to, in that instance, save those people. But there's the risk as well, you know, to American soldiers, their families. Decisions even on trade and economic policy have bearing on the future of work in this country and dignity. And I think we learned the hard way in the 2016 election how much resentment had built up just over the extent to which so many people were being left behind, or felt they were being left behind, in the way that economic policy was being constructed, particularly as it related to international trade. And so it's just whether it's like a life and death issue or an issue of dignity and other forms of livelihood and survival, just finding ways when you're in these jobs to put yourself in the shoes of as many other people as possible, and to try to have a composite kind of assessment, make a composite assessment of what the right thing to do is, because so many of us are we're single issue people, where we act and feel on the basis of our own experiences, and that often leaves out some pretty critical potential beneficiaries, but also people who are going to suffer the consequences of bad choices.
Again, an encouragement to people to read the book. That very poignant letter that you wrote to your son is in the book, and incredibly powerful to read. So we've kind of jumped ahead to you being a member of the Obama administration. I love in the introduction of the book, you talk about that transition from kind of being a flamethrower working on the outside to all of a sudden being in the famous room where it happens. And that sometimes reporters would ask you, you know, what would the old Samantha Power say to the new Samantha Power? And you just, your answer is that they actually know one another quite well and speak often. But what is it? And you're now been nominated to go back and serve in our government. Maybe just, you know, talk about the difference between being a professor, or being a journalist, being an activist, or actually being a policymaker.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the outside, when you are fortunate enough, as I ultimately became, to, you know, let's say, feel like you're writing for audiences that have some influence, you, in my case, you maybe feel like you're mastering the craft and you're learning how to be a good storyteller or a punchy communicator, and you're able to get access, let's say, to the New York Times or the New Yorker, or the kinds of publications that I've been lucky enough to write for. You kind of feel a sense of satisfaction if you nail the argument, right? Or if you paint the picture in as vivid a way, if I'm writing a long magazine piece. And, you know, my journalism was always kind of motivated by my activism. And so, you know, I had to play it straight in how I wrote, but fundamentally the choices I made about what to cover were motivated by believing that the changes of some kind were needed. So you kind of, you know, after a months potentially reporting, and you close an article, and then it just goes into the abyss, and you hope, and maybe you tell yourself on a good day that somebody influential is going to read this article and do something about the thing that you're describing. And when you're in the government, you don't have that luxury. You aren't spending as much time out in the field or in the world talking to people who are directly affected by decision making. I think that's a downside for me, who is like a plant in sunlight when I'm out in the field and in the world. But it's an inevitable downside because you can't be everywhere at once. But when you are part of a policy debate and you fail to prevail, as it won't shock you, happened a few times in my time in government, there's no alibi, right? You know how things are going, you know that whatever tool you had thought might be brought to bear for whatever reason, that is not going to happen. And often you're the person who is wheeled out to defend the policy with which you disagree. Now, again, if this had happened routinely when I served in the Obama administration, I would have made a different kind of career choice. Luckily, it was rare enough. Also, when President Obama had landed in a different place than I might have had him, it was never where I kind of stormed home and said, Cash, you won't believe, what the president decided. I mean, it was always, I always felt he's seeing, a set of, he's seeing the full field, right? I mean, the domestic constraints, he's talking to Mitch McConnell every day or, however many times a week. Everything has to be weighted again in a much more comprehensive calculus. and I'm able to be kind of single issue maybe for this day on this issue. And I think the system, by the way, it's good that there are single issue people. I mean, I was never single issue in the sense I was UN ambassador doing all the foreign policy issues, but on a given day in a given meeting, you might be pushing from one standpoint. And those vectors kind of coming together, especially if you're a decision maker like Obama was, and I think like Joe Biden will be, who values that kind of scrum and watching people, argue amongst themselves, and then makes a judgment in some ways on the basis of hearing that scrum play out in front of him. I mean, that's very different than models of leadership where, you want to be told that you're right and you don't want to see dissent. You want kind of crisp and clean meetings where, I think we've seen leadership like that, between Obama and Biden a little bit in certain issues at least. So, I think that was the hardest was, just knowing that there's no door number two, right? And I think especially Tom being UN ambassador, and it'll be interesting to see how much this has changed or not changed in the 4 years that have elapsed between Obama and Biden. But it wasn't just that I knew there was no place to go in the US government. I also knew that there was no other country that's going to lead on behalf of LGBTQ issues or on behalf of Syrian refugees, at least in a manner that's going to have the potential to catalyze the other democracies of the world to do more. And so that I think was I wore the issues, I think, I don't want to say more heavily, because when I was a young reporter, of course, in Bosnia and had so little experience, my whole identity was caught up with what was happening in the war there. But there was definitely a heaviness to being in the government, because in a way, you know the limits, the constraints, sort of up close. At the same time, the exhilaration and sense of satisfaction that one has as part of a team. I'd always worked alone as a journalist, as a professor, as an activist. I had some teammates too, but in the government, it's a lot like baseball. There's nothing. Occasionally there's a home run, right, where you can do one thing all by yourself, but by and large, you got to move the runner over, you got to hit the cutoff man. There's this team of people that has to work in sync. And for example, on the Ebola crisis, that's probably the best example of how that team kind of gelled and came together, with the president leading, deploying 3,000 health workers and US troops to West Africa in a way that, just helped those countries build Ebola treatment units and labs, and just the contact tracing networks, the kinds of things we need so desperately on COVID. But the US to be at the vanguard of that, and me then as ambassador working with my friend John Kerry, who was Secretary of State, taking what we had done and then going to other countries and saying, okay, Cuba, how many doctors are you going to provide? And okay, China, how many Ebola treatment units are you going to build? And hey, okay, we, the US, we're going to be lead in Liberia. UK, what about you being lead in Sierra Leone? And that, seeing that catalytic leadership, I mean, the sense, I never had that kind of sense of purpose and on one level relevance and impact on the outside. And so that's the trade-off, right? Is that you're in for the disappointments, you're in on the takeoff, you're in on the landings. And depending on how the plane lands, you feel rightly, I think, responsible. And I think if you fob it off and say, oh, that's Obama's decision, not mine, I think you're not true to the mission that the president gives you. So I mean, the reason I've decided, despite my life in Concord, to go back in, I mean, it's really, difficult to leave what we've built here for our family and for our kids. But it is because of that sense of impact. And then beyond that, the sense of national and international crisis. I mean, things feel not 4 years worse, but with COVID and the economic crisis and the insufficient progress on race and the absolutely woeful lack of progress on climate, just to take the main crises that are facing us, never mind the crisis in US credibility, it didn't feel like the right time to stay on the sidelines, given that the president, now President-elect, but President Joe Biden wanted me as part of his team. I thought, geez, if he thinks I can help, I think it's time to salute given the circumstances.
Great. We're going to bring some students in now. We didn't ask for female students. We asked for a call for students. Each school nominated a young woman to ask their question. And hopefully Bo McKenna will be joining us. She is a student from Concord Carlisle High School. And if she doesn't come, well, let me ask you, I was going to ask you the question about, looks like Bo is joining us. So, and Bo is a dual citizen. She is born here in the United States. Her parents have British roots, and she hopes to continue her studies at the University of Bath next year. But Bo, go ahead and ask your question to Ambassador Power.
Good morning, Ambassador Power. When negotiating with other foreign leaders, how aware do you need to be of your own cultural assumptions and biases? And do you at times need to suppress them?
Well, you asked the question in the right sequence, right? So first you need self-awareness, which, anybody who brags about being self-aware, you have to question their self-awareness. So I'm probably one of those people. It's a great question. I mean, I think the best things you can do, you can never fully inoculate yourself, right? I mean, it's just like unconscious bias as it relates to gender or race, or other characteristics, religion here in this country. I think we've all learned a lot about ourselves and how much more progress needs to be made, even among people who thought that they were the most progressive on issue X, Y, or Z. So the best you can do, I think, Bo, is, in my experience, is you surround yourself by the most diverse possible team. So within the tent, within the family, you want to try to ensure that you'll have people who either call you out. So you have to create a culture, right, where people feel comfortable. And this is within in my context, the American team, who themselves might have backgrounds, speaking languages, be like you, be dual nationals, have experience traveling, working at embassies or other places internationally, so that they can, sort of alert you to what you might be revealing about some of those biases. And then well beyond a bunch of Americans who happen to have traveled a lot, talking to one another, I think just what I wrote about in the Education of Idealists, that is my favorite part of the book probably, is, one of the things I did when I became ambassador is I went and I just paid courtesy calls on 191 other ambassadors, which doesn't sound like that big a deal because they were all in New York. These are ambassadors deployed by their countries to the UN. But just the act of stepping into their shoes, not having asks or trying to get at anything out of them, but just sort of listening to where they came from letting them see me as a human being, talking about my kids, my family, the chaos in my life as I was trying to juggle being a mom and working in this full-time national security job. If you can build those bonds and that just those connections, and it's, one meeting certainly didn't do it, but it was a foundation that in the case of about 50 of the country's reps that I visited with, no other prior US ambassador had ever visited because they were from small countries, or because those individuals would come to the US mission because we're so big and powerful and we're the host country for the UN. So just that preliminary outreach and then the investments in those relationships that came subsequently meant that what I tried to do is create channels of communication where, even though I was America, those other countries and their representatives would feel comfortable calling me out to. And I don't mean in a hostile way. I mean, people be very careful and diplomatic, but I mean, just feeling free, to speak their minds and to offer their independent voices on certain issues or on how America was processing. And I'll give you one example just of what I take as relative success, where I had lunch one day with the Bolivian ambassador, and Bolivia was led by Evo Morales, and was, there was a lot of kind of what we would have taken as like anti-American rhetoric and sort of Hugo Chavez kind of way of talking about the United States in terms of public rhetoric. And so the relations between the US and Bolivia weren't that great at the time. But I went out to lunch with the Bolivian ambassador, thought I should get to know this guy and maybe he can give me some insight and hear how we're coming across. And he said a couple things to me. He said, I can't tell you how incredibly disturbing it is for us in Bolivia, but well beyond in the region, to have Americans constantly talking about Latin America as in our backyard, in our backyard. And he said, I don't know if it's the translation into Spanish or what, but we think of like there are garbage cans in the backyard, like like that it's like the back, like kind of, and I'm looking out at a nice backyard here. Like to me, I didn't think of the backyard as being some kind of pejorative thing, but anyway, he was so adamant about it. So I was like, took the note and, ended up chatting with a number of my colleagues in the US government, just saying like, let's scrub this. If it bothers even one person, like what's the point? There are other ways to talk about this incredibly important and vibrant region. And then the other thing he said is that one of my predecessors and a dear friend, Madeleine Albright, had long ago in the Clinton years referred to the United States as the indispensable nation. And again, what she meant was a version of what I said earlier in this conversation, which is that the US is often a catalytic actor at the UN and in other places. And sometimes if the US stays on the sidelines, as it has in recent years on critical issues like climate, it's not the case necessarily that some other powerful country is going to step up and lead in the ways that we would wish. And that was really what she was saying, is that we have a critical role to play. But the Bolivian, said to me, Sasha was his name. He said, indispensable. You guys, all of you use that to what you're basically saying is the rest of us are dispensable. What are you doing? And so, I just thought, isn't that interesting? Like these reflexive terms that just make their way into our discourse, and where you never even re-examine the logic behind them, but that they can just do harm just at the margins. It's just words, but words can convey attitudes, which in turn often give rise to action. So it was interesting.
Thank you, Bo. Good luck. We're going to move to our next questioner. It's Megan Ding. Megan is from New Haven. She is hoping to get into the Air Force Academy. She has her nomination in. And here's Megan.
Hi, Ambassador Power. So I'm thinking of joining the Air Force, and I'm interested in what role you feel like the military has to play in humanitarian efforts. Can you give an example where that has happened successfully in the past?
Yeah, the best example I would offer in brief is the Ebola example, where President Obama was confronted with, and I write about this in the Education of an Idealist, but literally like a graphic representation of where Ebola was going. And now it, of course, is a preview of where COVID has gone. But it was a curve that was going from, I think at the time there were maybe 60,000 infections, and within 4 months it was going to be 1.4 million infections in West Africa, Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. But it wasn't going to stay confined there because I think about 40% of the air travel from Liberia to the US was dual nationals. There were a lot of Liberian Americans, for example. And so he's looking at it both from the standpoint of a humanitarian catastrophe and from the standpoint of US interests and needing to keep the American people safe. And yet there was no way to ramp up our work with our non-governmental partners or with humanitarian civilian groups quick enough. And one of the few actors that can just deploy in a heartbeat and can bring this logistic engineering prowess to bear is the US military. So he decided to deploy 3,000 troops and health workers. And I was in the meetings with, for example, the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of our armed services, Chuck Hagel and Marty Dempsey, respectively. And, they were like, the public health people are saying, oh, when our troops go over there, they just have to suit up. And the Secretary of Defense like, suit up? What do you mean suit up? Suit up in what? Like, these guys are used to wearing uniforms. And it turns out they, depending on the circumstances and how close they were to people who might have been infected, some of them had to wear hazmat suits. Mm-hmm. And they, put on the PPE that we now are familiar with in the COVID context. And some of them were lab workers, who'd worked, for the US military doing lab design on bio threats and so forth. And it was just to see the agility of the military. And the reason I mentioned that suit up thing is that to go from even having to ask the question, what do you mean suit up, to actually putting in place doctrine, protocols, rules of engagement that allowed the US military to help build runways so that shipments of PPE could arrive, that helped build the physical structure so that patients could be isolated, these Ebola treatment units. It was a sight to behold. And the other beautiful thing about it is that it was actually, I got to see the US military working alongside the Chinese military, not, like we would if it was a NATO ally, because just not yet with that level of comfort. But yeah, it's a little bit like what the US and Russia have managed to do at the space station for a long time. It's certainly what's happened in terms of the relationships with our European allies because of NATO. But in places like Afghanistan, where NATO made such an important contribution. And so you can also see, in a way, the diplomatic role on one level, or how our military ends up being ambassadors for our values, also the most diverse institution in our country. And at a time when America is sadly much more divided on immigration and on diversity than I ever thought we would be as an immigrant myself, still a kind of beautiful representation of the United States to have our military having interface with countries and peoples all around the world, representing who America is, which is this diverse tableau,
Thank you, Megan, for your question. Good luck with your application to the Air Force Academy. We're running a little low on time, and these are fairly large questions, the next two, Ambassador Power. So hopefully Nancy is joining us. Nancy Onyema is a student at Concord Academy. She is from Kennesaw, Georgia. And here she is. Nancy, go ahead. Georgia. Fellow Georgian.
Georgia. I'm very, very proud to be here right now. But my question for you is, can you comment on the global perception of America's moral authority on the world stage today, especially in light of the insurrection that recently occurred in our nation's capital?
Absolutely. And so I went to high school in Atlanta, Georgia, Lakeside High. So just for the record, and gave the commencement address at Concord Academy last year. Very proud of that. Here's what I'd say. I'd say the world sees both what happened on Tuesday and what happened on Wednesday. And for those, again, days ago now, but Tuesday, the incredible fact of grassroots organizing in the state of Georgia, overcoming some incredibly sophisticated attempts at voter suppression and disenfranchisement, just the ground game, the involvement of young people, the fact that a special election, which never generates high voter turnout, rivaled the general election with President Trump and Joe Biden on the ballot. I mean, the world saw that. They saw an African-American man who, preaches still in Martin Luther King Jr.'s church getting elected to the U.S. Senate. They saw, a Jewish American and a young man getting elected, I think reflecting the aspirations of future generations who aren't well represented in Washington. And so that happened. And then they saw, of course, the culmination of years of conspiracy theories, the stoking of white supremacy, I believe, and bigotry of all kinds, and of course the president's own false claims about election irregularities or rigging, or however you want to look at it. And so I think, our division is hurting us globally in a big way. I mean, in part, it just means that other countries, and I mean, even at the governmental or head of state level, they just don't know what they're going to get, right? They think, okay, we had Trump one day, we had Biden the next day, wait, 74 million people still voted for Trump, and yet Georgia just happened. Like, they're just super confused. And that's why I say Tuesday, Wednesday, right? If there are these grassroots forces that are trying to hold us accountable to the ideals that have been written on paper and into law. And it's not like foreign peoples only see what heads of state do, or only see Trump claiming the election was stolen. They see that. They see this bottom up activation. They see Black Lives Matter, which of course no one within the movement is satisfied with the progress so far, but they see that I think something like 50 of the biggest cities in America have changed, their rules and regulations as it relates to the use of force, in the police force. Not enough, like not close, but they see that activation has generated these changes. So I think they just see that there is what Joe Biden talked about in the campaign, which is a battle for the soul of America, and they're on the edge of their seats. They don't have a great second option. And let's be clear, like Obama used to always say this, that America's moral authority has always been really complicated. I mean, starting with, embedding slavery in our country's foundations, starting with, even with the Me Too movement that predated the full flowering of the Black Lives Matter movement. But, so much in our country that has gone undealt with. And so but our story, our power has always come from the idea that we're a work in progress, and that our citizens take into their own hands this self-correction, this need to improve, this need to hold people in power, including me, by the way. When I get into my job, like, I know my feet are going to be held to the fire, and they should be, right? That's our power, more than whether it's Barack Obama or Donald Trump or Joe Biden. It's what are our people doing? And so I think, to the degree that we end up restoring our credibility, it'll be because we can sustain this kind of bottom-up engagement the likes of which we have not seen before.
Nancy, thank you for your excellent question.
Thank you. And have a nice day.
And our last question is from Anna Park. Anna has an interesting story. She's our next door neighbor here. And when she was in 4th grade, her family went to Guatemala, and she has since created her own nonprofit foundation. She runs local charity races to raise money for schools in Guatemala. She's a freshman at Concord Carlisle High School. And Anna, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, how's everyone?
Good.
When you consider the general goals of international development, such as education, global health, economic development, human rights, and protecting the environment, how do you decide among them? Is one of these priorities more important to you than the others?
It's a great question. I actually, I was just named for this position a little while ago, and I've been getting briefed by really smart and caring people. And often I get briefed sort of in the categories that you're describing. So I'll have a conflict briefing, and I'll have a climate briefing, and I'll have a public health briefing. But I'm very pleased to say that none of my briefings has confined itself to the issue at hand, because I think what is crystal clear finally is this doesn't help to your question about prioritization, which I'll come back to, but they're just all intertwined. So climate change is causing conflict. Conflict is causing displacement. Displacement is causing surges of people into places that deplete resources, that has further knock-on negative effects on the environment. And by the way, with displacement, you see infectious diseases moving across borders in the public health domain. And of course, with conflict, climate change, and all the rest, the economic development gain, and COVID for sure, the economic development gains that were made in so many parts of the world have regressed massively. Everything is linked. And what I'm inspired by, and one of the reasons that I really am excited to answer the call of service, is that I think when you hear Joe Biden talk about Build Back Better, right? He says, what's your number one priority? COVID and the economy. What's your number two priority? COVID and the economy. COVID and the economy, 3, 4, 5. COVID and the economy. If you're president, it absolutely has to be. But when he talks about economic recovery, he embeds emissions reductions and clean energy and a wholly different way of thinking about the future of work and jobs. And so I think that way of embedding each of these issues in the other is where we have to go. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but you don't have the luxury in 2021 of saying, I'm going to prioritize COVID over the economy, over climate change, over racial injustice, over conflict that is causing, right? So the question is, how do you work with others? Because you can't do everything yourself. How do you bring, and by others, I think, and as a diplomat in terms of other countries, but also how do you bring the private sector, nonprofits like yours? It can't be top down, right? It has to be all hands on deck, and much more involvement from actors who have traditionally gone and done their work, but I don't think we figured out how to really scale and bring all of those actors together, behind like one comprehensive mission that has then these subcomponents.
Anna, thank you for your question, for your work for the schools in Guatemala. Let me just close, Ambassador Power, apropos to these 4 talented and articulate young women. I wanted to read words from the conclusion of your memoir in which you write, quote, I see among young people a fresh surge of interest in public service, born of recognition that each of us has a responsibility and an opportunity to make the changes we seek. But just like the role models that you write about in your own life, in your book, you are a role model to many of us. We thank you for your service. You talk about Jonathan Moore as someone who talked about public service with boundless delight. And those of us who are your admirers see that in you. We're so pleased that you've accepted this new nomination from President Biden. And we thank you for your service to your adopted homeland. And I'll close with a quote. It's a paraphrase of a quote from Dag Hammarskjöld that you help not to lead mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. So we thank you very much for your service. And we hope to see you here at the museum. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much, Tom. We love Concord, and we wish the museum all the best in this, as we pull out of COVID, the museum is going to flourish. So thank you.
Good. Okay, good luck. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for getting
Thank you.
Cheers.